Welcome to Fabric Monday. Today we'll talk about using safety principles to create data warehouses, making these safety principles owners of the data warehouses. There is one bad news. Workspace identities are not allowed as object owners. In this way, neither take ownership or the API to create the object works very well when we use the workspace identity. We need to create our own safety principle in Azure to make them an object owner. I already explained this in a previous video, how to create a safety principle. Let's review it a bit faster. First step, in Azure we go to Microsoft Entra ID. Second step, we go to App Registration, New Registration. Third step, after typing the name of the app registration, I register the app. Fourth step, I need to create the secret for the app. This we already went through. I'll not go over again. Let's skip this part faster. Let's open the Create Warehouse notebook. Let's analyze what this notebook is doing. First, I'm defining some variables which we will need during the process to create a warehouse. The variables, I will need the workspace ID, the tenant ID, the client, which is the safety principal ID, and the client secret, the safety principal secret. The next step is to build the payload. The payload is the information, the JSON information that we will send to Fabric API in order to create the warehouse. So I'm specifying this payload, and in this payload I have the display name of my warehouse, my new data warehouse, my new DW. And I'm also specifying the collation as case insensitive. I'm creating a warehouse using case insensitive collation. After that, the next step is that I need to authenticate using the safety principle. In order to execute the API to create this new warehouse, I need to have an authentication token from the safety principle. For this, I need to use the library Azure Identity. In this example, I'm loading the library or installing the library if it doesn't exist in the environment. These are the addresses that I need to use. The syntax to authenticate using with the safety principle. Tenant ID, client ID, client secret, and then get token, passing the API address. Using this API address to get an authentication token. Access token retrieves the authentication token from the result. I need to build this in a JSON, which I use as header to call the creation of the warehouse. The next step is the actual creation of the warehouse. In this piece of code, I can use the Simplifies library. I use the Simplifies library in Fabric to make the creation of the warehouse easier. So this is the URL I will call, but my call needs to be a post call, not a get. And I need to pass the authentication. So who is creating the warehouse is the safety principal. And I need to pass the payload. So I'm creating the warehouse. I pass both parameters, the header and the payload. This is inside a try except to check for any errors. And this is ready. This is my notebook to create a warehouse using a safety principle. Let's run this notebook. The notebook finished the execution with no errors. Let's take a look on the workspace to check the warehouse we just created. And here is the result. I have a new data warehouse owned by my SAFs account. That's it. Now I don't need to worry about user accounts owning objects, at least not the data warehouse. I can make data warehouse owned by SAFs account. We already created our data warehouse owned by a SAFs principal, but we can improve the code. We can make this code easier to use. I created here 2 additional notebooks, warehouse create and warehouse creation, to exemplify one possibility of making these notebooks easier to use. Let's take a look on the warehouse create. This is the notebook with the code to create the lakehouse. The first cell is marked as a parameter cell. This means that other notebooks can call this notebook passing these parameters. Which parameters? I'm expecting to receive the principal ID, principal secret, the name of the warehouse, and the workspace ID. Then, on the rest of the code, I created functions. Retrieve auth header to retrieve the authentication token from the SAFs principal, and then below create the W to actually create the data warehouse. The code is organized into functions, and finally the 2 last cells are the cells which trigger the entire code. We build the payload based on the parameters received. We call the retrieve auth header to retrieve the header for the SAFs principal, and we call create the W. In this way, this notebook to create a warehouse becomes reusable, and I can call this notebook from other notebooks. For example, I have another notebook here called warehouse creation. I have the values, which I will use for the warehouse creation. Then I build a parameter JSON to be sent to this notebook, and then I call MS Spark Utils notebook run warehouse create, and I pass the parameters that notebook is waiting. In this way, I have a notebook to create a warehouse owned by a SAFs principal, and I can reuse this notebook. Anytime I want to create a warehouse owned by a SAFs principal, I can reuse that notebook. You may also want to take a look on one previous video that I published about reading secrets from the key vault, because these values need to be safe. They can't be open like in this demonstration inside the notebook. We need to be reading them from the key vault. But this is another subject, and this is explained in another FabCommand video. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next week.